It's not that we infuse our writing with politics. It's that politics infuses us, right? We live in this, it's like the frog in the water, right? We live in the water of politics, whether or not we think about them consciously or not. I have a very expansive definition of politics. The way we approach the world, the assumptions we make, the stories we tell ourselves about how things could be, as well as the actual governmental structures, the ways people interact with each other, how it's allowed, what's not allowed. To me, all that is like this big word, politics. I like put it all in. I'm like a big tent person.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 159 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my bestie from the Midwestie, queen of my days, Greta Kelly. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to dust off my never-before-used poli-sci degree to talk about politics with Kate Elliott.
Here we go, putting it to use.
Yeah.
Take that, Jeannie. Let's go. Yeah, and if you want to read Greta, I mean, it's not like really like much political stuff in there. It's more just a bunch of
my first series is very political, epic
Frozen
fantasy.
Crown and the Seventh Queen and the Queen of Days, which is more just a bunch of shitheads pulling a heist and messing around with some dolls. So go check that out.
And of course, go check out Mushroom Blues for your daily dose of mushrooms, mayhem, and murder by our favorite Adrian M. Gibson.
Thank you. And you can go check out MJ's debut novel or book 2 in the Tales of Timor duology, Among Thieves. Basically, if you want more shitheads, more
axes
heists.
And assholes, guys. Come on.
Axes and assholes. Heists and hatchets. Let's go, baby. All right. And if you want to support us on Patreon, we'd really appreciate a little kickback. You can get some cool extras like bonus episodes, author readings, and more. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, joining us once again, the amazing Kate Elliott, author of the Spirit Walker trilogy, The Sun Chronicles, and so much more, including the newly released The Witch Roads. Welcome back, Kate. How are you?
Thank you so much. You guys really ran me through my paces in the first hour. So.
Yeah, but
we'll see if I have any brain left.
Get that second wind.
You limbered up in the break. We're good to go.
That's right. I'm ready.
Oh, heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Kate, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know her better. Today, though, we're drafting the laws of storytelling as we delve into a masterclass on infusing politics into sci-fi and fantasy. Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Welcome to Transference, where death and sickness are but a distant memory. Nicholas Five Boroughs is a sicko, someone that takes on others' illnesses. In a city where diseases can be transferred, the rich buy longer lives without pain, and the poor get a short life of constant sickness. Brought back from the brink of death by his friend Brian Meadowhearth, or maybe the invisible hand of an outside actor, Nick finally gets the chance to try and change things, to finally stop the whole disease transfer network. Tensions escalate as Nick infiltrates a higher society he doesn't understand, and starts to fall for Dorothy Sungate, the very person he needs to manipulate to be successful. And between run-ins with a talking cat, genetically modified humans, and a robotic police force, the world around him just keeps getting stranger. Can Nicholas tear down the disease transfer architecture? And how much of his humanity is he willing to bargain along the way? A dystopian vision of healthcare and a market economy, Transference will appeal to fans of Red Rising, Blade Runner, and the BioShock franchise. Soon to be a complete duology with the release of Transcendence in the summer of 2025. Transference by Ian Patterson is available now in paperback and ebook. Get your copy today. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. So just to kick things off, I want to know, what role does politics play in your everyday life, or just, where does your interest in politics, political fiction come from?
So I grew up in a household where, well, because I think in large part because my dad taught American history, that talking about politics, current events, and history was just what you did at the dinner table. That's just how I grew up. I found out later that he was mostly raised by his grandmother because his mom always worked. And my family is Danish American. My mother is an immigrant from Denmark. My father's grandparents were all immigrants from Denmark, except for his mother's mother, who is really the person who raised him. She's from the Faroe Islands, which, for those of you who don't know, is a small island group north of the Shetlands, but not as far as Iceland. So what the Faroese say is that it was settled by the Norwegian sailors and Vikings, if you will, who got seasick, and when they reached the islands, they said, "No, we don't want to go any farther."
They didn't want to go all the way to Iceland.
They don't want to go all the way to Iceland or Greenland for that matter. But actually, it wasn't settled as early as Greenland, I don't think. But anyway, so she's from the Faroe Islands. So it turns out that her side, that side of the family, the Faroese side, has a lot of teachers and also lawyers in it, and they were some of the people who were involved in the 1890s in what's called the Faroese nationalist movement. And by nationalist in the 1890s, I don't mean what nationalism. It's not the same as we would talk about it today. In those days, the Faroe Islands is a province or even a colonial dependent of Denmark, and has been for quite a while, for hundreds of years. So they were like a crown property. And in the 1890s, there was a kind of an independence movement, which is what was also called Faroese nationalism, where they said, well, why should we, either we should become independent from Denmark, or we should get more benefits and more self-rule. So that family was, my great great grandmother was, in fact, she had brothers and cousins who were involved in that, and they would hold the meetings at her. She had a boarding house because her husband was a ship captain who had died fairly young, leaving her with 1 to 5 children. And so she rented out rooms and then had a nice parlor, right? And they would hold meetings for this in the 1890s before she, in her 50s, immigrated to the US to be with where her 2 daughters and her son were now living. And that one of those daughters is my great grandmother, the one who raised my mom. So I think that I come by this interest, I think, via my dad, via his grandmother, via this history. I come through this kind of interest in politics. It kind of came down that chain of generation. It's pretty interesting.
That's an amazing trickle down. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
usually,
Yeah.
I think it's mostly an American thing to say, don't bring politics and religion to the dinner table, or to the holiday meals or whatever. But I think it's really healthy and cool that this is something that you can trace back in your family, this deeply engaged and politically active family tree, family line is very, very cool.
That's awesome. And it really shows through in your writing as well. And I think a lot of sci-fi and fantasy writers really like to dip their toe into political waters. What do you think it is about sci-fi and fantasy that makes it this perfect playground for examining and critiquing the politics of the real world?
I have a 2-part answer to that. So one of the things that I like to say, it's not that we infuse our writing with politics. It's that politics infuses us, right? We live in this, it's like the frog in the water, right? We live in the water of politics, whether or not we think about them consciously or not. I have a very expansive definition of politics. The way we approach the world, the assumptions we make, the stories we tell ourselves about how things could be, as well as the actual governmental structures, the ways people interact with each other, how it's allowed, what's not allowed. To me, all that is this big word, politics. I put it all in. I'm a big tent person. And I was talking with my sister I don't know, a year or two ago about a novel I was reading called Life and Fate. It's a Russian novel. It's a two-part novel. I only read the second half, written by an author named Vasily Grossman, who was a journalist during the Second World War, who, among other places that he covered, was in and out of Stalingrad at that famous and actually gruesome siege and battle. And he wrote this two novels related to each other, at which Stalingrad is the centerpiece of the story, and then also the purges and Stalinism. The second book was censored because it was deemed too injurious to the state, and it's actually kind of critical of Stalinism. People get put into jail for saying, I liked that one song Trotsky sang. It's like, bam, off to jail with you, right? And I was talking with my sister about this, and I said, yeah, it's such a political novel. And she said, oh, no, it's not. Not really. There's just that one scene in book one where in the first book where they go down to talk to some miners, and the miners have a conversation, a political conversation about, I don't know, communism or Stalin. Stalin is good to us, and that's why we work for the state, or something like that. And I thought, that's a very narrow definition of politics. Whereas to me, this whole two-part massive masterpiece, it's a fantastic novel. Especially Life and Fate is amazing. It's political. How can it not be political? It was censored by the state. They actually tried to destroy every copy, but they didn't manage to. That's why we have it today, right? How is that not political? It permeates every piece of that novel. Not everyone agrees with that definition of politics. So I will just say that that's my definition of politics. And can I add my standard disclaimer, which
Of course.
these are all just my opinions. No one has to agree with me. Take from it what you will, but I'm not going to say, well, I think. I'm just going to say. So it sounds like I'm laying down the law, but I'm not. I'm just saying what I think.
We were just joking when we said laying down the laws.
yeah, exactly.
It's a fucking tagline, whatever. All of this is
as a shorter answer, though, the real question you asked is, I think science fiction and fantasy is a great way to, everything we write, in my opinion, that's my last time I'll say that, is about now. We write in the present day, about the present day, whether we write a historical novel about Henry VIII, at the court of Henry VIII, or something set in the far future, or in a fantasy world, we're really writing about now. And what I think science fiction and fantasy does is it gives us a step back, right? We can take a step back, and then we can look at these, we can funnel, kind of examining things that interest us or trouble us through these settings that have some unreality in them. So it's not instantly. So if we want to write about, I don't know, a country falling into dictatorship, we set it over there. And then it's a remove. It's a step back, and it allows, I don't want to say objectivity, but it allows a degree of distance. And then you can add these other, and then, partly it's great just because you can add these other elements, ray guns and rocket ships and magic and dragons. What's not to love when you filter politics through those things? So that's what I would say. I'm really interested to hear what you two have to say, especially with your poli-sci degree.
Greta?
Oh, geez. Hot seat.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I agree in most cases. I think, especially right now, with political discourse being so heated here in the States, and either you agree with who you're talking to or you're a horrible human being, full stop.
Yes.
Science fiction and fantasy, like you said, allows that distance, but that distance in a weird way also creates empathy, which we are not as good at now as we used to be. And I think it's that empathy that we need to find if we're going to continue in a healthy way.
I agree. I think that's a really good point about empathy, because then we can say, well, the poor dragon rider, right?
Yeah.
Whatever else we may think about their situation, we can kick into them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say, honestly, like being a Canadian living in Ecuador, American politics, we're talking about sort of like the osmosis that a frog experiences, that permeating nature of American politics does extend to a lot of
It
the
does.
globe.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a crazy thing to see how one country can cause these ripple effects across so many other countries, right? Because Ecuador uses the United States dollar, for instance. I know there are a lot of countries around the world
Wow.
that use the US
Yeah.
dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, but also the fact that so many economies around the world are interconnected through trade and all this kind of stuff. And
Yep.
Trump is basically saying like, I'm going to shut down that one and I'm going to shut down this connection, and just,
Yep.
and it's
Yeah.
very, very interesting. But I
Yeah.
think science fiction and fantasy, that distance that you both discussed, is so important in order to not just absorb the information necessarily. It's like the recontextualization does help to be able to
Yes.
better
Yes.
understand the nuances of a situation and then form your own opinions based upon that. And it's like,
Mhm.
people are not stupid. Like, readers are not stupid. So it's like, if you are framing something in such a way where you are talking about a certain political climate, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, readers will pick up on those clues and they'll be able to understand the sorts of arguments that you're trying to make, the discussions that you're laying on the page, and then they'll be able to take all of that information and make their own decisions and form their own opinions based on what they're reading. So that's the beauty of information. It's like, people can read different news sources and dissect things in such a way that they make their own opinions based on all the information that they've gathered. But like Greta was saying, that empathy is really important to understand. Like, yeah, if you're the kind of person who watches CNN and you despise everything that Fox News does, understand that there are also people who love Fox News and despise CNN. So it
Yeah.
is good to be able to understand all of the different sides that are, taking part in this political game. So it is really fascinating, and as like an outsider, I'm kind of like, oh shit, this is just such a mess.
Yeah.
But it does still affect my life in
Yeah.
ways that might not be explicitly obvious to a lot of people. But Kate, I wanted to get your opinions on, or your take on, how you approach new projects when you're thinking about, okay, these are the sorts of sort of political themes and discussions that I want to tackle in a given story. Is that the stuff that you're thinking about at the beginning of a project, like you were talking about last episode, how your ideas kind of percolate over time? Is
Mhm.
that part of that, like the percolation of like, oh, I want to infuse this little aspect of the political landscape or what have you? How do you approach that when you're starting a story?
It depends, as always. I sometimes I think, like most writers, I have certain themes that I keep coming back to. And interestingly for me, and probably predictably for me, one of them is empire, because the United States is, of course, especially in the post World War II era, the world superpower. Um, there was that period where it was the US and the Soviets, but so that's like the context of my entire childhood, my entire adulthood. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of empire. What is empire? What does empire do? How does it affect things around you? As you said, these ripples reach great distances. And then how is it that people who can live within an empire don't think of what they're living in as an empire? And so I guess because my dad taught history, and I grew up with someone who saw things through that lens, that always affects how I think about the worlds I'm going to set my stories in. And usually there's an empire, but often I like have some different angle I'm looking at it at. I'm looking, well, I want to think about this, I want to think about that element of it. But I'm trying to think how I'm a bit of sometimes I'll have like an idea, like with the Witch Roads. I had that idea where I want to see this setting, from the point of view of someone I want to see this setting, which is going to be a fairly status rank structured society, imperial society. And I want to see how it looks from the point of view of someone who's lower down in the status rank. So they're not. And so that drove the choices I made in terms of what could happen in the story. We don't go to the palace in the story. That was never in the cards. And then I have to think about, well, why this character? How can they see so many important things happening that it can drive a story? And so that helps me think about what's going to happen in the story. Well, okay, she's a deputy courier. She's basically the postman. That's kind of not quite right, because she has other duties like finding spore, right? Finding deadly spore, and she has other secrets. But then how do I bring the other people in the story into her story in a way that makes sense? So that then gets us, well, what does she do? She goes on this, she knows that her postal route, I'm just going to call it her postal route for shorthand, right? She knows her postal route. Well, it turns out they have to go on that postal route. So for me, these two things work together. I can't say, I'm going to set up this society and then I'm going to find these characters and then they're going to go in it. And what should the plot be? I don't work like that. Some people do. And it doesn't matter how you do it. But for me, the character and the society kind of develop together in the sense that I let them develop together, right? And so the story and where the character fits in the story and what I'm interested in terms of looking at the story. So I would probably not write a story I wouldn't write Succession or Severance, those two TV shows. I wouldn't write that story. They just don't interest me. So it has to interest me, first of all, but they have to fit, they grow together. Because the two things grow, they interact, they influence each other as I develop. And I might say, well, I could have this happen. And then I think, yeah, but it wouldn't happen. Once I start getting enough world and character information, I know what could happen, but I also know what wouldn't happen.
I like that. I like that your
Right.
characters also aren't always like the king or the general, but you also have people like Al in The Witch Roads, who is a courier. How do you decide who is going to be the ideal point of view character for any given story, whether it's a single POV book or a multi POV? And then branching off that, then how do you decide what, I guess, side of the political argument they're going to fall onto?
They, I don't know that my characters fall on sides in political arguments, in the sense that I think of them as living in the world in a particular space, and then they interact with whatever the politics are according to who they are, where they came from, in some cases what they need or what they want. Crown of Stars is probably, well, actually all my books are a good example of this. Crossroads are as well. Or Black Wolves, or for that matter, the Sun Chronicles. They're all filled with what we would call politics, and people approaching politics from who am I? Who am I connected with? What can I get away with? What do I want? What don't I want? And what am I forced to do? And in that sense, I'm a bit of an organic writer, in that I kind of let things. I know where I'm headed. I know what my end point is going to be, but I don't always know what's going to happen along the way. And I let what builds up as it goes fit that. But the process is hard. But in terms of picking characters, I don't know that I sit down and say, I want to do a character who's X. I think characters kind of go.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, it's me. I volunteer.
It's like
I volunteer
It's
as tribute.
it's like looking into a crowd of people from a stage and someone just raises their hand, gives you a little wave.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, how has it been because from what it sounds like is you sort of let these characters grow and sort of like come to embody their natural version of themselves. So how do like you're writing Elle in The Witch Roads, and you start to understand like, oh shit, these are what her political beliefs are, and then you can sort of contrast that with the political beliefs of a different character. How do you see that kind of growth within your characters when perhaps their political beliefs erupt spontaneously from just what's happening to them in the story and how they react to things?
So I guess I don't think of people as having political views in that sense, and especially not in science fiction and fantasy. I think that actually Greta touched on this, that we live in such a weirdly polarized world, and it's different even from when I was a girl, where people did have, political part. You might be with one political party or another, but there was like political views, but there were also just this more general sense of, I'm an American. I'm an American citizen. I happen to be an American citizen. So that means something. That's not a political view. That means something to me, but it means something to other people. It gives me some rights. It gives me some dangers. Maybe if I go to a country where there's a lot of anger at Americans, there's a whole, it might give me some protection. And so for me, I think I perceive politics in my novels more in that second way. So let's say Elle talking to, she has to remember. So s- part of it is her past, which you only really get some full details of at the very end of the story. So I don't want to, um, but part of it is she's marked by that sense that, well, fuck it, I could die. Right. So she wasn't raised and inculcated in the same way that other people who grew up in the society are. Then you can contrast her with someone like the warden Shilsu, who comes from a very high status, and kind of who is like an ordinary warden, which means that she's an ordinary warden doing what ordinary wardens do. But if push comes to shove, she can lean back on that status and use it in a way Elle can't. So now we see politics. And so in their cases, those aren't political views that either of them have. They're just what the larger politics of the setting allows them or doesn't allow them to do. And they actually, I think in the first book, and I know again in the second, have some discussions about this differing sense. So because I read a lot of history, and I always encourage people. I would always encourage people to read history, and because I find it comes in so helpful for science fiction and fantasy, where we're trying to envision a world that isn't our world. And people have different ways of understanding their world. They have different ways of understanding the cosmology of the universe. And those permeate how they view the world and what they think they can do, should do, can't do, want to do in the same way. And it permeates us as well. And one of the biggest issues I find with writers, and it, it's not necessarily bad. Sometimes I feel like not all people are aware of it, is how much our own worldview, which I'm kind of conflating with politics here, influences how we approach our writing and what we write about. Back to that thing, like the men in, a guy writing in the 60s might have a very narrow view of what women could do. And so that to me is a political choice. Not everyone would agree it's a political choice, but to me, that's a political choice. If there's only one or two women, and one is, says, here's your sandwich, honey, as he goes off to work, and the other one is, oh, I need to be rescued. And then to me, there's all this stuff sitting in that book that's not even being discussed or even examined, but the reader's absorbing it. And that's how I do politics. That's how I even define politics. This is this big world where people have expectations. The Witch Roads is is a bureaucracy heavy, top down empire. And how does that play out all the way down to the smallest levels? Who can talk to whom? In this case, there's an interlocutor. So if you can't just you can't speak directly to a prince. It's simply not allowed. I'm sorry. Here's a great thing from Macedonia, ancient Macedonia. One of the things about Philip and Alexander was that Macedonia, which was of course it was that you had a king and they had a queen, and queens had differential amounts of power depending, but queens had their own, they might send grain to a city where there's a famine, but and then they had a layer of kind of nobles, right? And then they had the kind of free, the bulk of the army was made up of like free farmers and people. And then they had, of course, slaves and people who weren't really citizens down there. But the thing about Macedonia that I find so interesting, different from, say, Versailles and Louis XIV, where you had this very, the Sun King and these layers of the court, which shielded him from the mass of people, which shielded him from the mass of people, right? No one could just go up. But in Macedonia, anyone could go up and say, hey, Philip. Well, King Philip, but they might just say, hey, and there's stories about this.
I would love that
there's stories about this.
It's just like, hey, Philip.
Yeah.
Philly boy. What the hell?
Yeah, hey, Philip. Some old lady could go up, hey, Philip, some of your army came in and they took my goat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to feed my grandkids? I don't have that goat to milk anymore.
Right.
And then Philip, but they could just do it.
It's not quite
this.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that wasn't true in Persia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that in Persia. The king was, again, behind layers of protocol.
Right.
You couldn't just go up and talk to the Persian emperor, the Achaemenid emperor. So those are whole different political systems colliding. How fascinating is that? I'm sorry.
No, it's super cool because it
really
really shows the ways in which culture and politics shape each other. Not just that one shapes the other, that they are this intertwined combination of systems, whether it's like cultural and social systems and political systems, all infused and all just kind of like commingling, and generation to generation, these unwritten rules that just get passed on from one person to the next. It's like, things don't change quickly, but in the grand scheme of things, from one generation to the next, that is quick. Just as an individual human being, it doesn't feel quick. That from when I was born to how I view things now, the amount of stuff that's changing about the world. What you were mentioning last episode about the ways in which publishing has changed from when you started back in the late 80s to now, coming up through the internet and the rise of certain technologies is just mind-boggling. So imagine, like, I think it is really important to understand that there are multiple sides to things, whether it's the fact that it's, maybe it's the Persian Empire and the Macedonian Empire and the ways in which their cultures and political systems differ, or on an individual level, that the way I interact with the world is different from the way you or Greta interacts with the world.
Yeah.
And even within a country like the United States, I think a lot of the divide within the United States feels like kind of manufactured division, in a sense, where it's, if you're spending all your day kind of listening to the news, watching the news, believing everything the news says, these are media corporations who are vying for your attention in the same way that YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or any of these platforms are vying for your attention. Your attention is their form of
commodity now.
It's their form of
a commodity,
exactly. And so it does help, it does help these news organizations and different forms of media to get your attention by, sparking
making it spicy.
Making it spicy, sparking your anger and that kind of thing. And so I think it is really important through fiction and like empathy, what you were mentioning before, Greta, to explore multiple sides of the same political arguments and discussions, and to give a little bit more nuance, to understand that Yeah, we may disagree about X, but we agree about the rest of the alphabet. So, in that sense, how can that approach provide a more nuanced perspective of this kind of argument, allowing readers to not just label one side as ally or the other side as enemy?
Read more. I'm a big fan of reading outside. Like like if I wanted to write a fantasy novel, I would not do my research by reading fantasy novels that are, that are in the kind of the same ballpark, right? I wouldn't, and it's not, I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy because I enjoy reading it. And also I like to keep up on what's new and see, who's coming in and watch kind of how things are changing. It's really exciting to me. And there's really nothing more exciting than watching. I think that kind of churn, people come up and it's like, wow, wow, move people, because you want things to move and churn. But I don't think that other fantasy novels should be one's research for how you're gonna create a world. Because I mean, to come back, not to belabor this point, but we do, like you say, we bring our own biases and filters and the things we're ignorant about into what we're writing. We can't help it, it's inevitable. But we can read, we can watch things we're not accustomed to, we can talk to people, we can listen. And most importantly, I think it's important to acknowledge that people live in the world differently. So when that the best example I can give from my own work is when I was working on like getting ready to when I was developing Crown of Stars and making a lot of notes and getting figuring out what was going on. One of my big problems. So that's like a really big canvas, um, and I knew what I had this symbol, like two triangles. And one triangle was there was going to be an invasion, a civil war, and a religious heresy. So that was like the real world triangle, right? And then the magical triangle was the magic, the not the animals, the mythical and legendary animals. And I think non-human intelligent people. I think those are the other three. But I really got stuck on the magic, because the kind of magic I was using in the story, or that I ended up using in the story, I don't believe in it. It's like I don't think you can do it, and I would keep get kind of like ramming up against it. And then one day I had a revelation. I said, I don't need to believe in it. They need to believe in it. It needs to seem ordinary to them. It and I don't need and so that's one of the biggest things that I feel is like I don't so much need my people to have political views. I don't need to display what their political views are. I need to understand how they see the world, and not and it's got to not be me. I mean, it can be me. Some people genuinely want to write a story that filters how they see the world into this other setting. And actually, and that's fine, because that's what they want to do, right? But for me as a writer, I'm interested in political systems, and in the way that two different cultural viewpoints will come together. The way that after Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he put together a corps of cavalry from young Persian youth, right? So that meant that these young men who were training to be part of the Macedonian army were in some ways, turning their back on, not entirely, because he was now the Persian great king also. They were kind of saying, well, we're going to go over here instead of staying Persian, right? And at the same time, some Macedonians didn't like it because they were foreigners. So it had all these different repercussions. But they also needed those people because they needed the extra troops, because the empire was so big by now. I'm kind of simplifying it. But if as a writer, I can be interested in what makes a person decide to do this. What's the benefit for them? And what about if two friends say, oh, I'm going to sign up, and the other one says, I'm not going to sign up, right? And well, that's what an interesting, it's not even what an interesting balance or conflict there is there with the decisions they make. And we're constantly making these decisions in life driven by how we perceive the world. And then if I can create a world where people perceive the world a certain way, and again, what makes Elle in The Witch Roads different is that she comes ultimately from outside. So she's always got that little bit of an outsider. Kem's not an outsider. He's an insider. And that's the difference between her and him. There's other differences that we found out in the story, obviously, but from his who his mom was, and et cetera, and who his dad was. But he's an insider. And so his whole view is going to be different from hers because she's always one step out, but he grew up in that. It's everything to him.
And that interplay is so cool though, because it's like, Elle she's the outsider, she's the other. And Kem, he grew up in this, but he also had this very deep connection to his aunt, right?
Yeah.
And so you're able to explore this discussion of otherness and this discussion of the outsider, because to every in-group, every other group is is comprised of outsiders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting to be able to see characters, and you do this in all your books, where you're giving multiple perspectives from the points of view of different groups. So how do you kind of play that into your world building, play that into the fabric of the characters and their interactions without anything feeling outright stereotypical or especially when it comes to conversations of otherness, hurtful?
As the writer, I need to know who people are. And it can sometimes take me a long time to figure out who someone is. But if I can write from their perspective of the world, and if I understand their perspective and how they fit in to the world along with the other ones. But there's one of the best ways, I think, just as a practical, pragmatic writing tip, is to use elements of ordinary life. So for example, since we're talking about the Witch Roads, so there's a sequence where they have to cross a pole. So these are these large, misty, like imagine a lake, only it's all this deadly mist that if you touch it, it'll be dead in 15 seconds or whatever, a minute, actually maybe more like 5 minutes of agony as you distort into something else.
Really drawn out.
Really drawn out, quite unpleasant. But there are these Holy Stone roads, and you asked before where Holy Stone came from. I don't know. I just thought I need a way for people to get around safely. So it'll just
fantasy, sci-fi.
It works, right? They don't know why. So I don't need to know why. They don't need to know why. It doesn't matter. So they cross the pole, and then when they come to the Vigil Tower, I simply describe the whole process by which they're all on the road, they reach the tower, and then they all have to go through this, even though Spore can't get up onto the road. Nevertheless, you have to go through this whole, you have to show your papers, and you have to, if you were a merchant, you have to have all your stuff, go through this whole process. And in the case of the people, they have to go through this stages of rooms where they, put all their stuff, and then they get pure water poured on them to make sure there's nothing on them. And then they go through this process. So first of all, this is a great way to show how controlling the empire is. Everyone just does it, and there's a good reason to do it. It also shows that it pretty much works, right? So that they've come up with, so I like that dynamic because it's very controlling. But on the other hand, it makes people safer. What does that mean?
It's like in space, like if there's like say there's a colony on the moon, they have to go through decompression and all that kind of stuff. There's so many different, or if you're in a biological lab, you have to go through decontamination protocols and all that kind of stuff.
And if you get a cut in your glove in that lab, man, right? Yeah. So you can, all of these are like practical, physical things. Physical life is a great way to express some of these things. So, and in the case of that passage, who goes through last? She does. The prince goes through first because he's the prince, and then he gets taken to a nice place where he can sit in a comfy couch and get fed, something to drink and a platter of something fresh from the kitchen, and he can lounge and whatever. She has to wait and wait and wait. And then she gets hustled through last, and then she doesn't even get anything. They like, we're going on, right? I think that's what happens that time. We're going on, So get back in the carriage. We're going on. So that's an expression of her status. And I didn't have to have anybody say anything about it. And it's the same way where you could, like, if you have an encampment, you have an army that's marching out and you have an encampment, and how are people interacting in that encampment? What are people doing? What kind of, did the officers all have these big fancy tents, or is everyone in the same kind of bivouac? What are people doing around the campfire? How are they getting their food? Are they fending for themselves, or is there a kitchen that was set up? And, do some people get different food than other people? These are all fantastic ways to tell us about, we don't think of that as politics, but to me, that's all politics. You can see people having a different kind of discussion in one place than another place. You might show the discussion between the soldiers here and what their concerns are about the campaign they're on. Are we going to get paid? We didn't get paid last week. Just got a letter from my spouse, and, something happened on the farm. And then meanwhile, in the officer's tent, they're debating some philosophical work they've all read, or they're talking about the campaign, or they're arguing about, which prince is really better, which general or which prince is better. And now we've got into the intrigue of it, right? Yeah. And someone can be walking through camp and hearing this, or someone can be sitting there and then called to go do something over there,
Politics
or
is
vice
gossip.
versa. So I think that the practical everyday things, where do people get their gear? Do they have to get it themselves? The whole thing with Elle and her boots, right? That she didn't have, that. Do you always get secondhand things, or do you always get new things? And how good are they? There's just so many ways. And I know that people think of politics as being like, we're having an election and we, who are we going to vote for and how are we going to discuss this? But to me, this kind of more expansive way of thinking of politics, say it's an army where you have two groups of people who have to work together. Maybe they're having dinner together and the one is using the wrong etiquette in the officer's tent, because they don't know, they didn't grow up. I mean, I don't know. I'm a big believer that physical detail and action, when someone walks into the seat of government, whatever it may be, who can walk into the seat of government? How do they have to act when they come in? Do you have to bow before the king, or can you go right into your congressman's office if you have an appointment, or do you have to make an appointment? I mean, so many layers here. And then different people you could have two people walking together and then they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't come in.
Yeah. Talking about like all of the physicality of environment, and even just like hearing you talk about you invented the Holy Stone just so they'd have like a way to get from point A to point B. Kind of reminded me about how in the first episode you were talking about being a kid drawing maps in your room. So it makes me wonder though, like, how do you use physical geography of the world as a whole to also inform character and conflict and whatever political machinations occur therein?
The all-important cultural ecology question. Because obviously, I think it's obvious. This is a reason that, anthropology is a complicated discipline now. It didn't used to be so much back 50 years ago, or, 80 years ago, when it was like, we're going to go study those people, only those people maybe don't want to be studied, and are people of their own right, and they don't need to be. But anyway, what one thing that cultural ecology did and anthropology did was help open up people who were living in a very specific and fairly narrow range of settings. This idea that the environment we live in is going to influence how we see the world, what we see in the world, what is important to us, and what knowledge we have. So if you're a farmer whose survival is dependent on understanding the natural world around you, is that a storm coming in? Is there frost in the air? Do I need to cover the orange trees? Um, you know, you're going to have a different set of skills than a fisherman who's going to have, and a fisherman's going to have a different set of skills depending on whether they're, in the northern whether they're fishing in the far north, in the Arctic, or in a temperate zone, or in the tropics. And all of those things will build out the world people live in, because they're not going to live the same ways. You're going to have people who live in extended family units, which is actually the most common way people live and have lived across many generations, in extended family units, and maybe in compounds with multiple buildings and chambers, because that's the most that's the form of living that allows them to best survive as people, because they get these different layers of labor, and maybe something about their environment means that they can use them in that way. Whereas in other cases, maybe you need to live in smaller units because because you can, or there's something about, I can farm my little plot. And if too many people are trying to live on this amount of land, we can't feed everyone. So we have to split up, and another group has to go up over there. So it's that similar to even thinking about something as simple as, if you have people in the tropics, would they have a word for snow? Why would they have a word for snow? And so what is it about the world? If their face is toward the ocean would be part of the cosmology, and the way they're I don't think governmental, the way their society is organized to govern itself is going to be adapted to the environment they live in. That's why empires tend to grow up in certain places and not in others.
Yeah. Or you see why certain civilizations, where it's like, where do all of humanity's earliest civilizations arise? Rivers, deltas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You see it in China. You see it in India. You see it in Mesopotamia, even earlier, Egypt.
Yeah. The Indus River Valley. There's just like so many different parts of the world where it's like, yep, this is where humanity, because this is actually something that throughout our conversation has been kind of concretizing in the back of my head, is so much of politics, especially in the way that you're describing, where it permeates every aspect of life. It's not just government. It's not just institutions and the concepts of political organizations, but so much of it has to do with access to the environment that we inhabit, access to the resources that are around us, access to certain types of specific social and cultural limitations that just build and build and build and build and build and create this foundation for what becomes our essentially individual and local political structure. And so I don't know. I want to get your thoughts on this idea of access, because it's like just in the last 5 minutes, it's just popped into my head in that one word, and I'm like, oh shit, that really
no. I think that's a great point, because if I'm going to write a story, if anybody's going to write a story, and they say, I'm not going to think about, and they think, rather than thinking about politics and there's the I'm going to support the greens or the yellows, what about access? And then this is also true for the question about how do we deal with, how do we as writers write about things that are like outside our specific experience, but without coming across as lecturing or condescending or bigoted or, you know, whatever. There's so many ways we can screw up. And I want to say that that I think that making mistakes is part of learning. That the important thing about making mistakes is going like, ooh, wow, okay, let me fix that. Let me think about that. I mean, that's what matters. That not that we're perfect, because nobody's perfect, but that we think about it. But that issue of access, like, what if, like, I think about, like, I'm going to build the society as I'm writing, and I think about it largely in terms of access. Who can go where? Who's allowed here? Which people are allowed to do what things? So one of the things I did in The Witch Roads was, as you will have noticed, the word prince and the word emperor aren't gendered. They're just titles. So an emperor might be a man or a woman. And I did that on purpose, the same way a prince, because I decided that I wanted gender not to be an issue. So this is a highly stratified society, but not on gender lines. I just wanted to, that was a choice I made, just to see what would happen. So a prince might be a man or a woman, but it doesn't matter. Now, if I wrote it, I could have written it differently. I could have written it in a more patriarchal sense. The Cold Magic books are set in a world that is, it's not deeply, rigidly, gruesomely patriarchal, but it is, it is more patriarchal. And it was actually quite easy to write that because it's what I'm used to, right? But now you have two different things. And once you pick any form of access, or, I'm gonna have this not be an issue, and this is something that's an issue in our society. I'm gonna have it not be an issue in this society. There's just always these little shifts that happen. I consider those political shifts, in that sense, because I think any writer could build an entire society just by starting at the top or the bottom or the sides and saying who can go where and who can get what and who can do what. And now all these lines will knit themselves together. And after a little while, you will find you have a society that functions something like a society does. I think it's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. And because every writer is going to bring their own personal experiences
Exactly.
into the story, that's going to be a political discussion. And if you do these shifts, that in and of itself is a discussion about the politics that you yourself have experienced.
Absolutely.
And therefore the story itself can start to foment these ideas within the reader, and also the characters and everyone who inhabits that world. Just what you were saying earlier about about Elle's access to certain types of boots. It was like, yeah, that says so much, because it's like that poor kid from a poor family who has really horrible, shitty sneakers with holes in them, versus the kid who's able to go to the store with his parents and go buy a brand new pair of sneakers every month.
Or right? who has 20 pair of Nike in their boxes, all brand new, never worn, because they want one of each pair, right? And
exactly
so
that.
that alone tells us so much about the world. So we don't have to say, and that's a way of putting in politics without having people having a political discussion. Well, the Prince so-and-so is backing the chariot team, the silver chariot team, but Prince so-and-thus is packing the gold chariot team. Who do you back, right? And people do have those discussions, and they can be used, but they don't have to be the only way that politics plays a role in it.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. There are so many ways that you can infuse politics into your stories, and I think, just be genuine about the way that you're doing it, and think about from the ground up.
And
I think
think
it's
about
really,
how politics infuses your own view, and
yeah,
then try to get. That's my thing is I don't want my characters to think like me. I want them to think like them.
yeah. Beautiful,
Perfect.
beautiful end note right there. Kate, thank you so much for doing this
Thank
writing
you.
class
Thank
with us. It
you.
was an absolute pleasure. And that's it for our two-parter with Kate. Thank you for chatting politics with us. This is kind of really, we talked about recontextualization earlier, but recontextualize my thinking about politics and the ways in which it permeates our lives in more ways than we think,
Mhm.
but also the ways in which so many people define politics is quite narrow. And I think if we can open our minds a little bit more, then that'll result in better stories. That'll allow us to better interact with the stories that we read.
Yeah.
So
And maybe with the world we live in, we can
exactly,
hope.
and with
Yeah.
each other.
Yes. And with each other
And
on that
with each
happy
other,
note.
just
Yeah.
getting all like peace and
Yeah.
love at the end.
Love.
Wait. What is the BTS one? Yeah. It's like,
Yeah, just like a little thumb
Oh,
heart.
yeah.
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 Youth is
Youths
assemble.
assemble.
Oh my god, Greta. Well, okay, thank you again. And thank you all for listening. If you want to support us on Patreon, you can hear an exclusive reading by Kate from The Witch Roads, which is out now. You've got like decades of amazing books that you can read and pick up by Kate.
I do. So yeah. So let me just say that if you search for where should I start with your novels, Kate Elliott, you'll find a long blog post I have up on my website that describes my different series as if they were members of a boy band.
Ooh.
And so,
Speaking of boy bands.
yeah, speaking of boy bands, and I did that so that because some of them are very different in tone, and so it's like, well, if you want, a peppy, funny story, this kind of fits that more, and if you want a grim, dark, serious story, this kind of fits that more. So that's one place to look.
Amazing.
At my
Well, send me the
stuff.
link for that, and I'll include it in the description and the show notes.
Okay.
And yeah, just go support Kate because she's wonderful and deserves your support. So, Kate, where can folks find you online?
I am most easily found on you can find information on me on my website, kateelliott.com, 2 L's, 2 T's, or imakeupworlds.com. They go to the same place. And I'm on Blue Sky. I am on Instagram, but I never post there. I'm more active on Blue Sky. And that's about it. I've actually closed down a lot of my online social media.
That's totally fair.
Yeah.
This day and age is very reasonable.
Yeah. I need to get some writing done.
Yeah. Unlike Kate, you can find SFF Addicts everywhere. At SFF Addicts Pod, you can find me at Adrian M. Gibson. You can go check out Mushroom Blues, available in all formats, wherever you get fine books. Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I'm on mostly Instagram and TikTok these days, but a little bit on Twitter still at Greta K. Kelly. And if you're interested in some more political epic fantasy, go check out The Frozen
Support
Ground.
Greta's poli-sci degree.
That's right.
I used it.
I used it, Mom.
All that money wasn't for nothing.
Exactly. And go support MJ. Go check out Among Thieves. Support the Thorin Food Fund. Her cat needs to get fat is pretty much our motto. He's more fur than fat, so feed that cat. Thank you all so much for listening. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.